morning. I sure am glad to be with you today. I hope today is a wonderful day for you. This morning when I got up early, I went out the front door. I'm not going to tell you why, but I went out the front door to check something. When I went out, it was cold. And I said to myself, I can't believe we're in the middle of May and it's cold. But it's interesting because this is my favorite time of year, like this, and then late in the fall when it is cool in the evening and warmer in the day. And it's interesting because everybody likes something different. Some people love it when it's cold. Oh, they love that winter time. Give me snow, give me ice. Not me. And other people like the summer when it's really hot. Some people ask me, they said, Preacher, would you rather have it cold or hot? I said, I'd rather hot. And they said, Why? I said, Because I'd rather sweat than shiver anytime. But my point is that no matter what we think in this life is perfect, it doesn't last long. It's going to change. When we were living in Chattanooga, and we lived there for a number of years, but when we lived in Chattanooga, there was a motto there, and it was this: if you don't like the weather, it'll change in about 30 minutes. Well, that was somewhat true because it was so vastly different almost day to day. But you know what? The Bible says, This is the day that the Lord has made. I will rejoice and be glad in it. Now, let me say this to you. That doesn't mean I always rejoice in the weather of that day. I rejoice in the life of that day. God has given me another day to live, another day to serve Him, another day to enjoy what He has given. And so that's what we want to do today. In fact, it's interesting because today, as we have been talking about gates and entering into gates, we're going to be talking about a shut gate today. And so I hope that you'll stay with us. In Nehemiah chapter 13 is where we'll be. And so I hope you'll join with us there. And maybe perhaps something we have to say will be a blessing. I was looking up something to use for a thing I'm working on, and I read this. It was a meme, and it showed a solid black screen, and it said the song of senior citizens, and then it had these words: "Hello, darkness, my old friend. I stood up too fast again." Well, I don't know about that. But one lady said her greatest enemy to losing weight is how the chocolate companies manufacture their candy bars. She said they always make them in squares. But if you try to break off just one square, half the candy bar comes off and you have to eat the whole thing. Well, I suppose if you need an excuse, there you go. I can identify with that one, by the way. Our text today is found in Nehemiah chapter 13. Those of you familiar with the book of Nehemiah, you remember that it is the story of this man, Nehemiah, who was in the palace in Shushan, and people came from Jerusalem. He was the cupbearer for the king, and so he is working there in the palace, and friends came from Jerusalem, and they told him about the condition of Jerusalem. The walls were broken down, the temple was destroyed, the gates were burned, and the people were scattered. His heart was broken, and Nehemiah prayed, God, would you please help me to do something? Well, he went in before the king, and the king looked at him, and he said to him, he said, Nehemiah, what's wrong with you? And as Nehemiah said, I had never been sad in his countenance before, never looked sad. And so he shared with the king his burden for his hometown. And the king said this. He said, you go and you fix it. I'll pay for it. I'll provide all the supplies. Not only that, I will give you letters from me for safe passage all the way for you to do the work you want to do. And so Nehemiah came, and you know the story. The book of Nehemiah is about the rebuilding of the city and the reestablishment of worship in the temple. Well, in Nehemiah chapter 13, it's finished. And the Bible tells us in beginning in verse number 19, and it came to pass when the gates of Jerusalem began to be dark before the Sabbath, I commanded that the gates should be shut and charged that they should not be opened till after the Sabbath. And some of my servants I set at the gates that there should be no burden be brought in on the Sabbath day. So the merchants and sellers of all kinds of wares lodged without Jerusalem once or twice. Then I testified against them and said unto them, why lodge ye about the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you. From that time forth uh, came they no more on the Sabbath. And I commanded the Levites that they should cleanse themselves, and that they should come and keep the gates to sanctify the Sabbath day. Remember me, O my God, concerning this also, and spare me according to the greatness of thy mercy. The story of Nehemiah is one of the great testimonies of God's unfailing grace and strength. He used a people in captivity to rebuild the city of Jerusalem and to reestablish the worship that God had ordained centuries before to his people. When Nehemiah came back to Jerusalem, he found the whole city in disarray. The walls were torn down, the gates were burned, the temple was destroyed. But one thing that he found also was this, that the Sabbath day was no longer kept. It was like any other day. And what was happening, and our text gives it to you, that what was happening, the merchants treated the Sabbath as any other day to do business. They would bring their merchandise into the city and sell as at any other day. It reminds us of our day today, doesn't it? I can remember when I was a boy, there were only a few things that were open. Most things were closed. If you traveled on Sunday, many times it was hard to find a service station open where you could stop and get gas. There were some, but it was not everywhere you turned. But today, Sunday is business as usual. However, Nehemiah had the gates shut on the Sabbath day so that the merchants could not enter. And then when the Sabbath was over, they would open them again. I love the phrase where the Bible says Nehemiah told them, he said, don't you do that anymore. They did it 1 or 2 days after they shut the gates. And so he goes out there and he says, I, I will lay hands on you if you come back again. I'm going to get you. And so they didn't come back anymore, but they kept the Sabbath. And then Nehemiah gives an interesting instruction. If you know the history of the nation of Israel, the Levites were the keepers of the temple. That was their job. They were to watch over it. They were to clean it. They were to make sure everything was taken care of. And they had certain jobs within there. But now Levi or Nehemiah says to the Levites, he says, you clean yourself. You get clean. And this is the exact word, verse 22. I commanded the Levites that they should cleanse themselves and that they should come and keep the gates to sanctify the Sabbath day. When I was reading that, I was thinking about the day in which we live. I believe one of the problems that we have is within the church. The world is going to do what the world is going to do. The world does not appreciate the Sabbath day. They could care less. It's business. But for the church, it ought to be that we keep Sunday, the Lord's day, for Him. And we're going to recognize that day as His day. I think many in our day today in which we live forget the importance of the Lord's day and treat it as any other day. Some will say this about, I can't go to church because Sunday is my only day that I have to do whatever. However, if we are saved, then Sunday isn't our day. It belongs to God. Sometimes we need to shut the gates to stop the merchandising of the Lord's day. Nehemiah challenged the Levites to cleanse themselves and then serve the Lord to keep the gates. In days gone by, when the Sunday school was just beginning, people did not have Sunday school, or as it later was called, Sabbath school. They did not have that. And so when the Sunday school movement began, primarily for children, to gather the children, teach them the Bible, many clergy were opposed to that. They said it's not right. It's a violation of Exodus, where the Lord told them to keep the Sabbath. He said it's a violation to have a school on the Sabbath day. Well, of course, the truth is it was not a violation because it was a continuation of worship and teaching the people the Bible. And there's a story that was told, and I think this is a great illustration of something. The Bible says man was not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath was made for man. Because the Bible says to us that as the Lord made everything in 6 days, He rested on the seventh day. And it says the Sabbath is a day of rest. There was not to be any, as the Bible calls it, servile work. You're not supposed to labor on that day. In the Bible days, they could not do anything, or it was a violation of the Sabbath. But the Sabbath day was made for man. Say why? For our benefit. 6 days shalt thou work, but you need to rest on the seventh day. That's because it's good for us. It's a renewal day. There was a story told of a wagon train of Christians that were traveling from St. Louis to Oregon. They had decided they would all go together, and so all of them got together. They're making that trek from St. Louis to Oregon. Every week they observed the Sabbath day by stopping to rest and not traveling. But as winter approached, some in the group began to panic that they would not reach Oregon before the snow fell. So they proposed that we start traveling on the Sabbath days as well. The group was split over whether to travel 7 days or only 6 days. Well, the 6 day group said, we're not traveling on the Sabbath. And the Sabbath day group, or the 7 day group, said, well, we're going to travel. So they split. And the 7 day group, they took off. And the other group, they rested every Sabbath day. The group which rested every Sabbath day arrived in Oregon before the other group did. When they began to ask them the reason why, because the people and the horses that rested on the Sabbath day could travel further and more efficiently on the other 6 days. I was thinking about that in regard to just what we know of today. And I began to think of the overtly religious origins, all the way going back to biblical days, of blue laws, where in states they said, okay, you can't sell this on Sunday. You can't do this on Sunday. In fact, one state has it where you are not allowed to sell cars on Saturday or Sunday. That's interesting. But those blue laws by states have been upheld by the Supreme Court. And I want you to listen to what the Supreme Court said about these Sunday restrictions. It said this: the court found that they serve the secular purpose of providing a uniform day of rest and relaxation for the community and protecting workers. You reckon God knew that we needed a day of rest? You think God knew that we would need that day of revitalization? And of course, in for God, He tells us the greatest need we have is to get our minds off of the labor of the 6 days and onto Him primarily to refocus, recharge spiritually. When Chick fil A started business, the Cathy family, who founded it, made a statement. They're Christian people, church people. They said, we will not open on Sunday. We'll be open Monday through Saturday. We will not open on Sunday. People said you'll never make it in the fast food environment. McDonald's, Wendy's, you name them, every one of them open 7 days a week. Did you know at the last count I heard, I think Chick fil A is second, only behind McDonald's, who's been in business since the early 60s. They're only behind them. God has blessed their honoring of the Sabbath day. They have kept the Lord's day. Every company would do well to remember what God said. It's the Lord's day. John, the apostle on the Isle of Patmos, said this in Revelation: I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. I would say if there's ever a day we ought to be in the Spirit, it's on the Lord's day. We have a young man in our church who he sends me texts a lot, but almost every Sunday after church is over, he'll send me a text about an hour or so later, and he will say this: I feel Jesus today. Well, I want you to know, I believe if there's any day of the week when we ought to feel Jesus, it's on Sunday, because it is His day. But we will never keep the gates of worship unless we are willing, first of all, to be clean ourselves before Him. As Nehemiah said to the Levites, you clean yourselves, then keep the gates and keep the worship. God bless you today for listening. Hope you'll join with us again tomorrow, 8:30, right here. May the Lord bless you today. That's my prayer for you.